today has asked me repeatedly the following question, which is, it seems that there are so many different groups that are trying to get AT&T to participate, whether they be standards bodies, whether they be open source projects or hybrid groups. And a fundamental question that every end user is asking is, how many do I need to join? How should I participate in each? And please God, how can we make sure that these groups are aware of each other and are actually collaborating with each other? And so I would like to invite on stage here 4 individuals, each of whom is representing one of these major efforts. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Guru Parulkar. As you know, Guru Parulkar is a professor at Stanford. He's the executive director of OnLab that leads ONOS. He is also the executive director of the Open Networking Summit. Come on up, Guru. He continues to teach, he runs labs. Really, the best way I think I can describe him is he's a man with his fingers in more pies than Yogi Bear. Thank you. Next, I'd like to introduce Justin Pettit. Justin is probably best known for being one of the co-creators of OpenFlow on one hand, and today, probably even more importantly, and one of the key, or maybe the key dev on the Open vSwitch and the new Oven projects. Thanks. And sorry, I don't have a cartoon analogy for you.
Okay, sorry.
Next, I'd like to invite Dan Pitt. I think this man doesn't really need much of an introduction. He's executive director of the Open Network Foundation.
Thanks, Neela.
And then finally, Prodip Sen. Now we're asking Prodip Sen to change his hat in this case. Not only is he a CTO at HP, he's also a man who played a critical role in the Etsy NFVISG. I always stumble on that one. And more recently, he is now the chair of the board of the OPNFV project. And so I wanted to start this session by asking each of you to do 2 things. First of all, if you can talk a little bit about your role, what it is that you do as part of this organization that you're representing up here. But also, I'd like to hear a little bit about what kinds of ways do you interact? What kinds of ways have you collaborated with other groups here or other groups outside? Guru?
Oh, you want to start? So yes, I play right now 3 roles. I'm at Stanford University, where I run 1 or 2 research centers, primarily focused on SDN and open networking. I run Open Networking Lab, that is the host organization for another open source network operating system called ONOS. And I also run this Open Networking Summit, which is an organization that runs Open Networking Summit once a year for the community. And so I've been doing this for more or less kind of 8 years now at Stanford. So what Justin and Martin started at Stanford with OpenFlow and SDN. So all these organizations, their primary purpose is to make SDN happen. And when we say SDN, there is a particular definition of SDN and open source version of SDN that we are trying to see happen. And today I was only here for half day in the morning, and I want to congratulate Neela, I want to congratulate ODL community, I want to congratulate the community as a whole, how far we have come with SDN and NFV. And I want to just make 2 points. One is there was a back-to-back talk, one talk by Cisco, one of the largest incumbent in network infrastructure industry, and then there was a talk by AT&T, one of the largest service providers. And I loved both those talks in terms of how far the industry has come. Cisco embracing open source, Cisco embracing SDN, opening it up, and making it happen. And of course, AT&T, I love AT&T for how AT&T is doing it. So anyway, so we have come a long way. And I really want to congratulate the community as a whole, what we have done. What do I do to cooperate? Every once in a while, I have conversations with Neela as a corporation in terms of how we do in open source SDN. Recently, we met a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, And we had 2.5 hours of conversations. And we had so many topics that we see the world the same way, and what the same challenges and how the industry is moving and all of that. So I think there is a cooperation, and Dan and we sit together in the same space. So Open Networking Foundation, Open Networking Lab, and ONS, they cooperate in a big way as well. So anywhere we are trying to bring SDN, we try our best to cooperate and make that happen.
Great, thank you, Guru. Justin, can you talk a little bit about your role and in what ways you collaborate with other groups?
So I work on the Open vSwitch and the newly formed OVN project. So I think most people are probably familiar with Open vSwitch. It's a virtual switch, open source, primarily programmed through OpenFlow and OVSDB. And we have a new project called OVN, which provides virtual networking for Open vSwitch, and we've been that's where we've been putting a lot of our effort in lately. Primarily, the way that we've been interacting with other communities, we're fairly low in the stack of networking parts. Above us, usually you have OpenStack that's controlling Open vSwitch or OpenDaylight, and then you have beneath it we have Linux, which is usually how Open vSwitch is deployed. And so we have to interact a lot with those communities to get new features added and to find out what features are wanted by the various platforms. And so I was vice chair of the extensibility group of OpenFlow up until a few months ago. And so I had a lot of interaction with sort of what went into OpenFlow, which is the primary way that we program flow forwarding. Since then, we just decided to, some of us decided to switch roles. And so Ben Pfaff, who's another one of the core contributors to Open vSwitch, has been taking a more active role now in the specification process. And we've also had to do a lot of work with the Linux community, because while Open vSwitch, it seems like we're kind of control of all parts of Open vSwitch, is actually not true on the Linux part, because we need to, the upstream maintainers decide what actually goes into the kernel module. And so there's a lot of work that we have to do sort of down below to ask for new features to be added to the Linux kernel for integration of new features. And so that's where we've been spending a lot of our time lately.
Great. Dan?
I've been working in a full-time capacity with the Open Networking Foundation since we launched in March 2011. And we came out of Stanford, really initially focused just on the OpenFlow protocol, which expanded into the OpenFlow substrate, which has a lot more involved to it. I sublet space from the Open Networking Lab. We have a couple people there. I only have 3 other full-time employees, a few part-timers and various sort of contractors and outsourcing folks, and 2,000 to 3,000 volunteers from our member companies. And as we've gotten kind of the plumbing more solidly in place with the OpenFlow substrate, we've been doing a lot more work on layers above that to really make SDN available to the services that really define company strategy. And the more we do that, the more other groups are related to what we do, are interested in exploiting SDN for the benefit of the constituents that they have. And as we do this very eagerly, we're championing open SDN, where the interfaces, protocols, and APIs are not just published, but also developed by the community and not by a single party. We find we have richer and richer interaction with a variety of groups. And as we have been on our own journey from just doing specifications to also producing software, as we call it, going from PDF to Python, we're finding many more readily available avenues for getting what we do into the hands of the user community. Our sole measure of success is the commercial adoption of OpenSDN. And so bodies like OpenDaylight are critical to making that happen, because you can take open source code and you can do something with it right away. So we have a number of projects with OpenDaylight, a number of projects with ONOS. I was yesterday at the Metro Ethernet Forum meeting in Vancouver. We have projects with them, and tomorrow I'll be at the Stacking IT meeting in San Francisco. And so our interactions and relationships with these other bodies really have kind of 2 dimensions to them. The first is an intent-based dimension, in which we declare that we really want to make these things work well together. And that stems from a lot of personal relationships and commitment to a unified mission. And then the other dimension is getting people in the trenches to actually do the work and come up with concrete results of our collaboration. And that's what we try to do every day.
Great, thank you. Now, Prodip, about OPNFV.
Right, so before I talk about OPNFV, let me just step back a bit and talk about NFV itself. So I, along with Margaret and a few others, were involved in the original creation of this whole industry forum and movement around NFV. We launched the ETSI on NFV a few years ago. But as we were working through that and creating the initial framework, creating a common language for people to talk about so that we knew what problems had to be solved, we realized that we wanted to get to a rapid adoption phase and a rapid implementation phase. And if we continued down the path we were going and followed a typical telecom standardization path, that would be a disaster because that would take a long time and we'd miss the windows of opportunity which the market were throwing at us. So we wanted to find a way to accelerate standardization, accelerate implementation, and we landed on open source. We decided that open source, a few of us who were involved in the at CISG got together and said we need an open source effort which is focused around NFV, and that's the creation of OPNFV, the Open Platform for NFV, which I currently chair the board of. But let me say, OPNFV is a slightly different kind of open source effort because by its very nature, it has to use pieces from various other efforts. Because for the full NFV infrastructure, you need controllers, you need orchestrators, you need the virtualization environment. So you need things like OpenStack, OpenDaylight to work together and other things beyond that. So we realized that there's no one place in the existing open source efforts which could do what we wanted, and that was one of the reasons to create it, is that think of OPNFV as more of an integration project. It's really taking code from upstream projects and putting them together for the purposes of NFV. And in that process, if we discover things which are gaps or capabilities we need, that's would be fed back into the appropriate upstream project. So by its very nature, it's a cooperative project because it has to work. We have to work with OpenStack, with OpenDaylight, with Ceph, with KVM, with Linux, whatever pieces we're putting together at any one time. And so that's been the nature of how we work. The individuals who are part of our effort are also involved deeply in these other upstream projects. So they take that work with them into those projects. And so we're trying to work very cooperatively with all these upstream projects at a working level, at a sort of strategy level. We have discussions on what is important for us and what perhaps we want other efforts to emphasize. So at all levels, we've been working cooperatively with them.
Great, thank you. I wanted to switch to a topic that I get a ton of questions on, and that is OpenFlow. We're pretty fortunate to have on stage here, on one hand, the person whose organization maintains OpenFlow, one of the early creators and probably the largest downstream user of OpenFlow, and a gentleman who, among other things, runs a project which is one of the largest OpenFlow focused controllers out there. And I'll tell you, I continue to get question after question about OpenFlow. What do I think about OpenFlow? Does OpenFlow scale? Is it the answer? Is it one of many? And if we look just, for those who weren't here the last couple days, it's interesting, OpenFlow has gotten mentioned a lot. A few of the case studies I presented yesterday on stage were leveraging OpenFlow in production. At the same time, we've heard people talk about PCEP. We've heard people talk about BGP. We've heard a lot about loving netconf. So we've certainly heard about other southbound protocols. So I was interested to hear from folks on the panel, 8 years later, where do you think we are? What has worked well? And also, looking forward a little bit, where do you think we're going? What is the future for OpenFlow in the industry? Which of you wants to start?
Guess I can start.
Sure, go for it.
So, yeah, as Neela mentioned, we've been a big user of OpenFlow basically from the beginning. We wrote, some of us wrote the original specification along with the reference implementation, and then we started the Open vSwitch project, and that's how we've always used OpenFlow to program Open vSwitch. And it's been a very useful protocol for programming that. I think one of the, I think part of the reason people are asking questions about OpenFlow is that the specification itself has some difficulties. I mean, one of the problems it had was that it's trying to program both software switches and hardware switches, and the flexibility of each of those is very different. And so it created this tension whenever we were trying to do the specification about what we can do in hardware versus what the flexibility we need in software. And so while we still use OpenFlow, I think it's the right way to program Open vSwitch. We had some more difficulty using it to program hardware. I'm hoping that some of these efforts like P4 will provide some more flexibility so that OpenFlow or some other SDN protocol can kind of actually deliver the original dream of having these fully flexible networks. So yeah, we've been using OpenFlow. We plan to continue to use OpenFlow. We're still using OpenFlow as a method for programming our soft switches in our projects.
Yeah, so OpenFlow has had an interesting trajectory. Very early adoption of OpenFlow 1.0. But when it moved to multiple tables, starting in 1.1, it became harder to implement in merchant silicon for the hardware switches. And what we have seen as we've continued to build it out and add features is that finally it's getting into hardware switches of a variety of types. And I mean, even when we showed it at the Open Networking Summit, our Atrium demo, we had 2 white box switches running Broadcom chips. Then we had 5 vendor switches. 2 were NPUs. One was an FPGA, and one was a proprietary chipset. Another was a Broadcom with their own operating system. They were all making it work on 1.3, and almost for the first time, it was interoperable. We've had a challenge with interoperability because we put so many features in, and there's so many extensions that they didn't really interoperate. We had a long time coming out with any kind of an interoperability specification for 1.3, the multiple table sort of stable hardware implementation version. And for that, actually, we mined the work done with another open source controller, Ryu, out of NTT in Japan, and in a facility they had to sort of test switches for compatibility with Ryu, and at the same time have a very efficient coding model for testing feature support. So the challenge of interoperability we are finally tackling in a variety of ways, including with sort of open source implementations that are kind of de facto industry agreements. And we have seen lots and lots of deployments, but they're not typically multi-vendor deployments. The question of scale I don't fully understand because Google has been using it between their data centers since they announced it in 2012, and it started before that. And then last month, they announced that they're using it within their data centers. These are enormous scale. Also at ONS last month, Alibaba announced that they're using it in a combination with VXLAN for their hybrid data center networks. And these are ginormous networks if you know the scale of Alibaba's business. AT&T said that they are using it to do service chaining, also in the Open Networking Summit. And then Brian Larish from the National Security Agency got up and said, "Oh, we're totally sold on SDN." He was at our Plug Fest, and that they're all bought into what OpenFlow does for an abstraction. Getting it to work in a multi-vendor environment has been also a challenge. But he and others came to a really terrific meeting that Inder Monga, who's in the room, set up among the research and education networks in Livermore, Lawrence Livermore a couple weeks ago, or Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory a couple weeks ago. Internet 2, a bunch of other research networks and campus networks, they're all using it, and they're all sort of struggling with some of the challenges, but there's nothing else that they would actually do for that. So, and a lot of other deployments of it are just kind of invisible, and companies aren't advertising it so much. All the people that mentioned it at the Open Networking Summit, they weren't saying, hey, we're using OpenFlow. They're saying, here's a service we're doing, and by the way, that's one of the tools we do it with. I talked not too long ago with Basil Alwan, and I said, I'm just curious, what do you do with NewWatch? What's your position on OpenFlow? Do you care? He said, oh, well, we use OpenFlow. We don't advertise it. We advertise the service we offer. It's just a nice vendor-neutral, functional SDN southbound protocol that is widely available. And so it's part of what we offer. We just don't talk about it.
Right. All right.
I just want to make one point that, yes, I think Dan and Justin covered it very well, but I hope we don't go back to the world. Yes, OpenFlow may not be perfect, it's still evolving, P4 is on the horizon, that's great, but hopefully we don't go back to the world where we have these boxes that have closed proprietary control plane, they have a BGP, and they make, I make your BGP programmable, and this is my SDN, take it and be very happy. So hopefully, we are not walking down that path, because that will be a very dangerous path, and all the gains that we have made, we would give up all those gains. Now for a short term, for legacy thing or for interoperability, if yes, you have a BGP box and it needs to somehow fit into your network environment and you make it programmable, great. But if that is the long term, then I think we have taken a step back. As much as OpenFlow may not be perfect, it needs to evolve.
So I actually want to hone in on that. That was actually where I was going to go, which is it seems clear listening to Dan that there are clearly people who like OpenFlow, use OpenFlow. We've had some real success, yet people are still talking about other protocols. How do you see the market evolving? Is OpenFlow the right solution for most use case and over time will gain significant share? Or do you see it as one of many, very good for some use case but not others? What's your view of this, Guru?
Oh, my view. So I think I have a wishful thinking, and what the world may turn out, who knows, right? So my wishful thinking is that, yeah, in the short term, there are many infrastructure deployed, there are all these other protocols, and we have to find a way to work with them and make them programmable and all that. So that is a reality that will stay. My wishful thinking, maybe 5 years down the road or some n number of years later, there will be much simpler forwarding planes, hopefully built with merchant silicon, white boxes, a very simpler protocol. Maybe it is a P4 that gives you all the flexibility, and then the control plane and things are running out of that. And I hope that becomes the default and mainstream of networking some few years from now. And that is my wishful thinking. Plus, I think if you look at what has happened in data centers and other places, someone like Nick McKeown said that is inevitable. That is written on the wall. Better make sure that you are part of it and not kind of closing your eyes and put your head in the sand.
Okay. Well, I think all interesting ideas. I don't know that we'll resolve it right here. Go. Please, Prodip.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think looking at protocols is fine, and they deliver some capability, but I think it's the wrong question. I mean, there will be multiple protocols for doing various things, as we've had in the networks for a while. I think it's more important to look at the capabilities you need and the abstractions you need to actually program the network. That's where the value is. And that's why I like the structure which OpenDaylight has, for example, which is building in the intelligence and then delegating the protocol to what it does best. I think fighting over a protocol is a waste of time. It's not the right place to be looking at. You really need to look at the capabilities you need and implement it the best way you can. And if you need a specific protocol, and OpenFlow does some things very well, do it.
Great. Well, we're about halfway through this panel, so I have some more questions, but I would prefer to have the questions come from the community. We have set up mics here at the front of the room on both sides. And so if you have a question, if I can ask you to stand up, make your way to the mic, you can queue up so that we have a few there. I'm happy to ask some more, but as I said, prefer to get you guys to ask some of the questions. No one yet? Well, as you think up your question, let me ask another question specifically to Justin, and others can come in. You've got a small team that's relatively well-focused. At the same time, the technology that you work on is leveraged very broadly across a whole set of use cases. Can you talk a little bit about how you manage all the different people who are interested in getting features, their code inside? Can you talk a little bit about your governance model and therefore sort of what are the highlights and lowlights of working with all these other different groups?
Yeah, so for the OVS project, I mean, like a lot of other, excuse me, sorry, a lot of other open source projects, really code is king. So, what doesn't work well is if somebody comes and says, I want this particular feature. It's not very likely, unless it happens to be something that was already on someone's roadmap, that it will get implemented. The way that the OVS project is managed is that there's a core set of committers that are not tied with any particular company. It's decided upon by the committer community who gets to be one of those core committers. So anyone can send code out to the Open vSwitch project. There's a public mailing list where all the code is handled. And then one of those core committers will look at the code, there'll be public review, and then one of the committers then makes the decision to pull it in. And actually, I mean, there have been very few cases where someone has proposed a reasonable patch and that it's not been included. So I mean, it's really, we haven't gotten a lot of sort of, bizarre off-the-wall suggestions. And so usually the feedback is just pure, like, is the code clean? And not, very rarely have we had someone with a suggestion that just didn't make any sense. And then, sorry.
No.
I was just saying, but then every once in a while, the core committers, we have a policy that describes, how you become one of the core committers.
Right.
And the core committers take a vote on people that they've seen very active in the community, that have done a lot of code reviews and have done and contributed a lot of code. And then we make a decision about whether we want to invite them to be one of the committers. And it's not based on affiliation.
How many committers do you have?
Right now, I think we have 9 or 10.
9 or 10 committers. Okay. Since I see people lining up, I'm going to go right to Margaret. I'm surprised you have a question.
Never mind. So this is interesting because we were having a discussion just last night about OVS being a community. Mm-hmm. In fact, we kept hearing it's really just one vendor really managing it, if I could call it that, and that there have been recommendations of certain changes that have gotten rejected. And there's this, we're noticing when you have these open source communities that get started by, I'll say, one group or one company, and then it goes out to open source, and they try to generate community, and all this stuff happens, and suspicion happens, I would say that, and then we get dragged into some of it, saying, we want to fork, we want to go to Linux Foundation to fork and so forth. And actually, we're getting this same discussion actually about OVS, which I thought was solved. So I'm glad to hear this, but it bothers me when I hear, well, we're getting asked, that the OVS is not as open as you're saying. It's not a community, and the committers are actually a set of companies that they feel are,
Well, I mean, so the committers it's all merit-based. And so historically, yes, they've mostly been Nicira or VMware employees because they were the ones who were doing the bulk of the code contributions. That started to change. We're starting to see a lot more commits from other companies where they're putting real resources behind it. So, it's true that still the majority of the committers are from Nicira, but they're not all from Nicira or VMware. We also have a committer from Cisco. We have some other ones from other organizations as well. And I would imagine that as people are contributing a lot of code, that will continue to grow. But if someone can point, I mean, I think we would be happy to have a discussion if someone can point to somebody who has been making significant contributions to the project and hasn't been a committer. I'd be interested to know about that person.
Well, we had a discussion with DBDK. Now we're having a discussion with this. So I'm saying, let's get the facts, let's hear it, and we'll try to say, okay, good.
Yeah, go ahead.
Did you want to address that? Did you want to address that?
If you want to follow that.
Yeah, I guess what I was going to say is that if you look at all the open source projects, there are many different models of open source projects. So there is not let's not, we are talking about open source. Let's not think about there is only one model of open source and that is the only model to follow and that is successful, right? As long as as we have to recognize this is a large industry. In this industry, there are many different pieces to be done. As long as people are contributing useful open source stuff, many models can be successful and those models can bring very useful technologies and solutions to the marketplace. And so let's not define one set of metrics and that only make one model look better. The metric of success is, have you contributed a technology that is making an impact on the industry and changing the industry in the positive way? And in that respect, again, I have nothing to do with OVS in some sense directly. I think OVS has had a huge success. Whether there were 8 committers or 100 committers is a secondary question. It is the key technology that is part of almost any open source SDN environment. And that model is successful for that particular technology.
So
Yeah,
Guru, are you
there's a-
saying governance doesn't matter, the way doesn't matter, you should judge a project simply by the technology that it outputs and its usage?
The impact and what it brings to the marketplace is the number one criteria, right? Because there are many models and different models have different trade-offs.
But how do you know that the person deciding or the group deciding what's valuable is objective enough? Which
I
is
think the
part of
penetration
concern.
is itself a metric of success.
I mean, you could also look at, I agree with what Guru was saying, but also I think that, another sign of an unhealthy project would be that if there were legitimate patches that were being rejected, if there was a history of that, then that would be a very bad sign for a project. But we have had OVS forked before. As you mentioned, the DPDK project, Intel had created a fork of DPDK, and and they worked on that for a while. Then we got with them and started working together on the project, and now they've stopped developing theirs, and they've been working on the core OVS for a while. And I'm certain that will end up meaning that Intel developers will now start becoming core committers as they start contributing more to the project. And affiliation with a company, and I don't know how much we want to talk about OVS in particular, but the being affiliated with Nicira or VMware does not mean that you get to be a committer. And so there are people on my team who are not committers yet because they haven't crossed that threshold. And so we try to be we try to be very fair about when we make the decision to include somebody, but it's not automatic. And also if there are cases of things that have been rejected from the project, I'd be interested to hear about them that have been legitimate.
Isn't the question of how do you trust the committers one that can be asked of any open source project, whether it's sort of started by one company or a big community effort? You always look at the quality of the code that is committed to determine the quality of the committers.
Okay.
You got a quick follow-up? We have a few others in line.
I know, well, Yuri's going to follow up on this. That's why I saw him. But I just had a second question for Jan. Why was P4 not part of ONF? That sort of surprised me.
So the question is, why is P4 not part of ONF?
So this is kind of a longer story. We started an open source project called Protocol Independent Forwarding. It was going to be just an open source thing, and we decided that what we would standardize, if anything, would be an intermediate representation. When you compile P4, since P4 was the first sort of language like that, or maybe the second, and it would expect it to evolve, and then there'd be others that would do an intermediate representation they could compile to, and then let that evolve as rapidly as it wanted to. Now, this is not, I think that there is no reason to think that we need to wait for P4 or anything else before deploying the 1.x versions of OpenFlow. We're up to 1.5 and planning for 1.6. And this will be around really for a long time. The thing that P4 brings to the table, I think more than anything else, is you have totally independent of, you can determine the pipeline of the chip, and you don't have to have any dependence on what the protocol fields are. And then you can really get to where any bit stream coming along can be parsed into a match action table. And this was one of the initial hopes of the whole SDN original project, even Ethane before it was OpenFlow, of being able to do research on protocols beyond IP and actually try them out at scale. So the researchers are really hungry for that. That's why it's come out of Stanford and Princeton. But the commercial market is not either ready or does not really need that yet. So this is all very early stage.
Okay, great. Let's go to another question from the audience. Jay?
Thanks, Neela. Great panel. So with much of this incubation,
Can you come closer to the
much
mic?
of this incubation coming out of higher ed and academia, it would seem natural to me that Internet 2, and of course Dan mentioned REN and Internet 2, would be a natural fit for most of the high-performance computing facilities. As an Internet 2 partner at Arizona State University, we don't seem to see much of that. So why is that kind of not being driven as well through that community, and what are the next steps there?
Which of you wants to tackle that one?
Where's Inder? There's Inder. Inder, you want to come up and answer that? This is Inder Monga from ESNet, CTO of ESNet.
I just want to say that 2 weeks ago, there were around 70 people in the room from NREN community universities, Internet to NRENs in Europe, gathered there sharing all their experiences with OpenFlow and how they're deploying it. So even though they may not be part of an ONF community, there are around 25 or 30 research associates from various universities around the world that ONF has that represent this body of work. And into ONF, I'm one of the people who liaise very closely with Dan on this. So there are ways, and I think I'm open to brainstorming how else, where do you see the gaps where you're not making headway, and how we can get ASU. I think Jay Etchings.
That's me.
That's you, okay. So you're now an ONF research associate, so welcome.
All right, I'll come back. Thank you.
So, but yeah, I'm happy to brainstorm and see how we can do, what the gaps you see and how we can do that more. Sorry, Neela.
Yeah, and on these collaborations, I think people know the next 2 days are dedicated to a dev design forum. We have both agenda items as well as on conference, and this is a great place, actually, for people who are trying to figure out how to work together to come together. So I hope we will get discussions like this.
Okay, actually, this is a follow-up to the first question that was asked. You mentioned at the beginning of the conference the issues of things like standards wars and the protocol alphabet soup. One of the things that I'm hearing in the discussions over the last couple of days is that it seems like there's sort of an emerging dependency on different open source projects, one depending on another, which may not be working at the same rate. I mean, the concern would be open source wars.
Right.
Who do you depend on? Who do you not depend on? Have you talked about that as a community, and how would you address that in a project like OpenDaylight?
Great question. Until you said the word open source wars, I thought where you were going was there's a time element to it. And maybe Prodip can talk a little bit about this. When a release like Lithium comes out, we finalize the release, we do a stable release, OPNFV picks it up, they have dependencies on OpenStack that has their own release schedule, then they package that up, then a carrier might end up deploying it. And so the question is, does that slow things down? Does that speed things up? And maybe what are we doing to better work together here?
Yeah, so let me talk about it from the point of view of OPNFV. So from the point of view of OPNFV, we've always looked at it as developing a framework, a reference platform, which allows many different ways of doing things. But precisely for the expediency you mentioned, we need to produce something which people can use. We make some choices. We make some choices of the upstream to use. That does not mean those are the only possible choices. That's just dictated by functionality we need, where it is in the other projects. Is it available? Can it be integrated in? We'll use it. So I don't think the dependency by itself needs to be controlled or dictated. It's good that we have all of these projects going on which are producing useful code. I think it's up to the users who are trying to put these together to decide how to use them. I mean, if you're trying to think of a grand coordination among all open source projects to deliver a project, I think that's bound to fail.
So in a sense, you're saying a reference architecture that out of the box supports every possible configuration is probably not a reference architecture.
No, but you clearly create a reference architecture which allows for certain possibilities, and then you make some choices on the immediate implementation. But we've been trying to be very conscious of not necessarily locking ourselves in. But there's a tension there which we have to manage. But that's the way to go. I don't think the business of coordinating all these projects makes sense.
Yeah, and what are the alternatives to having a dependency on some other organization? See, I don't want to have that dependency. Then you have to duplicate their work yourself.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
I think that's exactly right, which is the work OPNFV is doing would be done anyway by an AT&T, by an Orange, by a Telefonica, but with a fraction of the resources.
Exactly.
And so I think they serve a service to us, to Open vSwitch, and to other upstream projects by being able to concentrate that and putting the resources necessary to make it successful. Uri.
So I was obviously trying to see if I want to make a comment here as some potentially interesting / explosive topics came up, but since there was a reference implicit and explicit here, I thought, okay, I'll make some comments. I thought actually that the way a large company like Intel decided to some extent let go of some technology that it cares a lot about, like DPDK, and allow the community, this is us in the room here, have much more influence over there than what happened before, is an interesting lesson for us to actually talk about and continue this open industry conversation as to what is the right balance between what Guru refers to, hey, you know, it's successful, don't disrupt it, it runs very nicely, which I can easily say about DPDK. Anyone who wants to look into how x86 made progress, those of you who are old enough like me would remember sometime there were no x86 servers. Some of you would scratch their head to that comment. The same way DPDK is helping making inroads into the telco space. Yesterday, Neela in the keynote said, oh, look at this, how many NFV use cases are there? Let's see if the other pieces of the stack, namely OpenStack, Open vSwitch as an example, do they have the features that we need? So governance may change. We are talking about agility. Agility is not just for the coders. Agility may be something that you want to have also in other parts of the project. So a project is really measured not only by the code it provides to the market, but its ability to adapt to the different needs. And as Margaret pointed out, well, maybe some of the projects that are popular, like Open vSwitch, at this point do not have enough diversity to help us propel forward where it needs to be. Just food for thought.
And I think in a sense that one of the questions Uri is talking to and has been asked is there's a trade-off between focus and diversity in building a big tent. And you've all, I think we've all tried to deal with that challenge. Any words or reactions? Or we've got one more question and about 2 minutes to go on this panel. Which way? Burning reaction?
I think the thing is, yes, this is all good things, right? Focus is good, diversity is good, maybe in different phases of projects, different things are, maybe can be prioritized differently. But if diversity for the sake of diversity and a poor platform that doesn't do anything useful is, and if you only list how many diverse organizations are participating, how many committers do I have, and I say artifact does not matter, I think that would be a mistake as well. So governance is important, diversity is important, all of these, but at the end of the day, you have to produce something that is solving something useful, right? If it doesn't, other metrics have no meaning, right? But on the other hand, if you produce something that is very useful, and then you can say, oh, do I have diversity? How can I make it more? Because if you want to produce something useful and make it useful by the community, you will end up adding diversity. You will end up adding governance anyway.
Okay.
This is why the DPDK example was useful. It started with one company, and then when it reached, you know, broad enough appeal to the market, I would classify that as a very successful project. That's exactly what happened. I'm asking, is that a model we may want to follow sometimes? And that trade-off of focus, diversity, the progress specific technology makes in the industry? Those are interesting questions.
So I think there's always this
Last
tension.
comment.
Yeah, there's always this tension between focus and diversity. But I think the key here is governance. Good governance of the project will allow for that to happen.
Right.
Yes, you need to produce something useful, but if you have a poorly managed, poorly governed project, that's not likely to succeed.
Perfect. I want to thank
Only
you.
thing
We're
is
out of
if we
time,
can define
unfortunately.
good governance, if there are metrics for defining good governance, I would like to know. Because that is such a ambiguous thing. How do you define good governance?
It's like
Sounds like we
democracy,
have-
right? How do you define it?
No,
Sounds like we have topics for another panel.
Okay.
Thank you
Or
very
over a
much
bar.
to the four of you. Sorry, Christos.